Language, or verbal communication, is a tool that we use to communicate, but it is also easy to miscommunicate with language. Today we will focus on how using language can result in miscommunication, specifically why language barriers exist, common language barriers, and then some simple suggestions for overcoming language barriers. It is helpful to review David Berlow's SMCR model, where a sender encodes a message that goes through a channel that is then decoded by the receiver, who translates that into meaning in her mind. Language, then, is used by both the sender encoding the message and the receiver decoding the message, meaning that misunderstandings due to language are not always the sender's fault. Before communicating, the sender must first try to figure out what exactly she wants to say. What is the message? And then we have to encode our thoughts, translate them into words to convey our meaning. Unfortunately, some of us start speaking before we even get our thoughts in order. It is worse when what we have to say is important to us, or when we're emotionally involved. Sometimes we don't even know the words to communicate what we want to say. In fact, the words we want might not even exist in our language. Then we venture to say a few words, and those may not even be close to what we want to say. For some people, we have to hear what we're saying in order to determine if that's what we really mean. In my case, for example, I find that my brain seems to work better when my mouth is moving. Talking actually helps me think. Once those first few words leave our mouth, we might even want to take them back. But as you know, communication is irreversible. Those words have already been translated to the receiver, who then decodes those words back into meaning in her brain. And if our egos get involved, many times we can't even admit to the other person that we didn't mean what we just said. And once communication breaks down, it's hard to repair it. Miscommunications can lead to disastrous consequences. In interpersonal communication, it can result in hurt feelings, broken relationships, bruised reputations, and worse. One major cause of miscommunication, and the one that we'll focus on now, is that we rely on language or words to communicate. Yep, it is the words themselves that often cause the problem. We encode our thoughts and feelings into words and decode the words of others into our own thoughts and feelings. But let's turn next to word barriers, and the most obvious is based upon the principle that words are culturally bound. A word may mean one thing in one culture and one language, and something entirely different in another. A Hindi saying is that a normal word in one language is an abusive word in another language. But beyond unintentionally offending someone, culturally bound words can cause confusion. For example, in traditional British English, the term moot point means a point to discuss. In American English, we use the term moot point to mean that something is not worth discussing. It has no practical value. It is a moot point. Confusion due to cultural issues is obvious, but let's turn to another cause of miscommunication, and that is that we assume. Playwright Oscar Wilde observed that when you assume, you make an ass out of you and me. Unfortunately, we assume much too often. Many word barriers are based upon this assumption. Realize that language is imprecise. It is ambiguous or vague. It has been said that the average word in the English language has 5 different meanings. If I'm thinking of one definition and you are thinking of another, we have a problem. The American Cancer Society noted that some U.S. residents smoke a moderate amount, while others are heavy smokers. But what does that mean? What is a heavy smoker? A quick search online revealed answers from 10 cigarettes a day to over 60. Wow! No wonder we miscommunicate. We all have different meanings for that one word, heavy. By the way, the American Cancer Society defines a heavy smoker as smoking more than 20 cigarettes or 1 pack a day. We also tend to be what one of my colleagues calls linguistically lazy. We tend to use the same words over and over without finding the best word to describe what we want to say. How many different ways can we say happy? Is there a difference between ecstatic and content? Yet we continually use happy to describe our emotional state. Not only is imprecise language a problem here, but we also make the situation worse because we are too lazy to find the best word. In the 1989 movie Dead Poets Society, English teacher John Keating advised his students to avoid using the word very because it is lazy. A man, he said, is not very tired, he is exhausted. Don't use very sad, use morose. He concludes that language was invented for one reason, to woo women, and in that endeavor, laziness will not work. Another barrier related to this is bypassing, also called equivocation, when the same word holds different meanings to different people. Let's say you and I are going to the movies together, and I tell you that I will get to the theater early. You say you will also get there early. I arrive 15 minutes before the show starts and start tapping my feet. You are late. When you breeze in 2 minutes before the movie starts, I'm very upset because our meanings of the word early bypassed each other. So who gets the blame for this communication? Me, because I wasn't specific, or you, because you didn't ask for specifics? We also tend to take shortcuts when we use words, again, assuming that others know the same shortcuts. We use slang, sometimes referring to something good as sick, for example. We may use jargon, which is language used for a particular activity or by a particular group of people. Stat, S-T-A-T, for example, in the medical profession means immediately. In law enforcement, GSW stands for gunshot wound. Now, jargon can be very helpful in getting the point across quickly to another person, but that's only if that person knows the jargon. If not, then jargon just confuses the issue. As we use language to communicate emotions, we may not always consider the impact of that language on others. When our emotions get involved, it's very hard to encode a message, and if the word has strong meaning or emotional value to the receiver may actually stop listening for a while. This especially holds true for biased language, such as language based upon race, sex, sexual orientation, age, ability, the list goes on. Also, profanity and obscenities can be hot buttons for many people. We also tend to speak in absolutes. We present information as if there are no alternative views. An example of this is polarization, which is the tendency to describe the world in terms of extremes or polar opposites. We speak about things in a dichotomous fashion, as either black or white, with no mention of any gray areas. You call someone stupid or smart, but there are shades in between. Again, sometimes we don't have the words to describe these gradations. What word would you use to describe someone who fits here on the scale? So we almost have no choice but to use extreme language. This leads us to a very similar concept of static evaluation. I'll admit, for example, my first year in college wasn't my best, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I am a bad student today. Static evaluation implies that things don't change, but as the cliche goes, change is inevitable. Another related word barrier is allness or overgeneralization. You might think of this as polarization to the extreme, using some form of the words always and never, as in all women are bad drivers and all men are jerk. Using this language often puts people on the defensive. Semanticist Wendell Johnson cautioned that always and never are two words you should always remember never to use. Now this next one, if I've said it once, I've said it a million times, is hyperbole. Okay, maybe not a million. While hyperbole, or exaggeration, is used extensively in advertising, we use it in conversation as well when we say we have enough food to feed an army, for example, which is most likely an overstatement, a hyperbole. We also use language to understate or overstate. Oftentimes we understate when we don't want to hurt someone else's feelings. For example, if a child is being bratty and we don't want to offend, we may use the word precocious. We will often use euphemisms, which are polite expressions used in the place of words or phrases that otherwise might be considered harsh or unpleasant to hear, like saying, "We put a pet to sleep." How can we overcome some of these language barriers? Well, here are just a few brief tips, many of which are plain common sense, which, as we know, is not always so common. First, be other-oriented. We tend to be egocentric. We don't think about the other person when we're choosing our words. Secondly, try not to assume. Clarify, repeat, paraphrase. both for your benefit and the benefit of others. Remember the KISS strategy. Keep it short and simple. Don't ramble or go on with a whole lot of extra details. You may want to think before you speak. Sometimes after thinking things through, you may decide not to speak. There is a saying that the kindest word in all the world is the unkind word unsaid. Just because you can say something doesn't mean that you should. If you think about what you say before you speak, you'll have the chance to organize your thoughts, to rehearse your words, to evaluate the situation, and then hopefully not say something stupid. This means that you may need to plan your message. What details are necessary to communicate? What's the best way to organize this message? And what's the best way for this particular person? And of course, you want to choose the appropriate words to communicate your meaning. Don't be linguistically lazy. Finally, listen. And this applies to both when you are sending a message or speaking, as well as when you are on the receiving end of the message or listening. Processing time here. Does the responsibility of communicating effectively with language or words rest primarily with the sender? Which of these language barriers is most problematic for you as a speaker? How about as a listener? And what other recommendation would you give to reduce communication barriers associated with language? No matter how you look at it, miscommunication is an inevitable part of life, and you can never truly eliminate it. But by paying more attention to the words that you use, you should be able to improve your effectiveness with verbal communication.